Welcome to today's Explainer, where we are going to dive deep into something truly chilling. We're dissecting the anatomy of a nightmare, specifically the ancient Japanese legend of the Ubume. Now, what makes this particular ghost story so incredibly terrifying isn't just the jump scares or the creepy visuals. It's the fact that it reveals the very real, very dark history of pre-modern Japan. So we aren't just looking at a scary monster today. We're actually going to peel back the layers of this mythology to completely dissect the legend and uncover the deep societal fears, the heavy religious stigmas, and the honestly harrowing realities that brought this blood-soaked phantom into existence in the first place. Get ready, because this gets pretty dark. I want you to just picture this for a second. Imagine you're walking all alone on a pitch-black, rainy night. The weather is awful, you can barely see a few feet in front of you, and suddenly, you hear a voice over the sound of the rain. You look towards the riverbank and spot a woman. She's weeping uncontrollably, her hair is wild and matted to her face, and her pristine white robes are completely soaked in dark blood from the waist down. She's cradling a crying infant, and she locks eyes with you, desperately begging you to hold her baby, just for a brief moment. Honestly, what do you do in that situation? Do you run for your life, or do you take the child? Well, that absolutely terrifying scenario isn't just a modern horror trope. It's actually the earliest recorded encounter with this specific spirit, documented all the way back in a 12th century Japanese text. According to the legend, a brave samurai named Taira no Suete wanted to prove his absolute fearlessness to his peers. So he intentionally rode out into the pitch-black rain to confront this rumor. He met the weeping, bloodied woman at the river, and instead of fleeing like most of us probably would, he bravely accepted the terrifying burden. He reached out and took the crying child right into his own arms. Tokugawa-era artist Sawaki Sushi actually captured this incredibly tense exchange in his artwork, perfectly freezing that moment of dread. But as you might expect, this legend comes with a massive, horrific twist. The very second Suetake secured the baby and tried to ride away, the infant in his arms grew inexplicably, impossibly heavy. It got so heavy it threatened to completely crush him or drag him down into the rushing river. He struggled with all his might, and when he finally managed to escape and look down at his arms to see what he was holding, the baby was entirely gone. In its place was just a lifeless pile of dead, wet tree leaves. So to truly understand why a story like this completely paralyzed people with fear for centuries, we really need to step back and dissect the anatomy of this monster. Think about the details. Why a weeping mother? Why a baby that suddenly weighs a ton? Why the dead leaves? You see, in ancient Japan, the wild forests and mountains were definitely scary, but domestic tragedy was a different kind of horror. It was a terror that happened right inside the home, to the people you loved. Let's break down exactly what kind of supernatural entity we're actually dealing with here. The entity we are talking about is known as an Ubume. The word itself is highly literal, deriving from characters that translate to birth-giving woman. She is a yokai, but unlike demons that are born from hellfire or ancient evil, the Ubume is born entirely from the profoundly human tragedy of maternal death and unresolved grief. The belief was that if a woman died during late pregnancy or during the agonizing process of childbirth, her intense anxiety and lingering love for her unborn or newborn child was so strong, it essentially chained her spirit to the living world as an earthbound phantom. Historical accounts and old folklore almost always describe her trapped in this ethereal, infinitely sorrowful state. She's said to have pale, deathly skin and long, disheveled hair. But crucially, she is always seen wearing white burial robes that are heavily soaked in blood from the waist down. This incredibly graphic visual isn't just there to be gruesome or shocking for the sake of it. It serves as a constant, horrifying reminder of the violent and painful end she met. It signals to anyone who crosses her path that her life was brutally cut short in the most vulnerable moment a human being can possibly experience. Now, there is a fascinating variation to this. In some regions, if the infant somehow miraculously survived the mother's death, the ghost takes on a slightly different, deeply heartbreaking form known as the kosodate yurei, or the child-rearing spirit. Instead of haunting dark rivers to trick samurai, this version wanders into local villages late at night. She goes to small shops to buy sweets so she can feed her hidden, living child. And just like Suetake's bizarre encounter at the riverbank, the coins she pays the shopkeepers with magically transform back into dead, dried-up tree leaves by the time morning comes. Up to this point, the legend of the Ubume is essentially a tragic, very human ghost story rooted in immense sorrow. But folklore is rarely static, and it almost never exists in a vacuum.
To find one of the strangest and most genuinely terrifying evolutions of this myth, we actually have to look across the sea to China. Because in the 17th century, the image of the weeping, blood-soaked human mother collided with a mythology that was much older and a whole lot more predatory.
What happened was that Japanese scholars essentially blended their local tragic ghost with a completely different Chinese mythological monster. It's a crazy mashup. On one side, you have the original Japanese Ubume, a humanoid spirit of a dead mother entirely bound by sorrow and maternal instinct. On the other side, imported Chinese medical texts describe something called the gu-honiao. This was a malevolent, monstrous bird demon that intentionally mimicked the cries of human infants to lure people into the dark, specifically so it could snatch their children. When these foreign texts reached Japan, the two distinct myths crashed into each other.
The result of that collision is absolutely wild. By the 17th century, scholars had created a nightmarish hybrid known as the Ubume. They essentially transformed the weeping human woman into a shape-shifting, bird-like demon. The stories claimed this creature would fly through the dark sky disguised as a gull. It would land on clotheslines in the dead of night and intentionally drip its highly poisonous blood onto children's clothing hanging out to dry, which would later cause deadly convulsions in the kids who wore them. It's a fascinating, terrifying shift, taking a ghost born from human tragedy and mutating it into a flying toxic demon.
However, if we peel back the monstrous feathers and look past the spooky ghost stories, we find something even scarier. The real horror here isn't the monster itself. The true nightmare is the staggering, grim historical reality that created her in the first place. The Ubume didn't just spring from someone's wild imagination. She was birthed by a society where bringing new life into the world was essentially a terrifying roll of the dice with death. You have to understand that in pre-modern Japan, maternal mortality rates were incredibly, devastatingly high. But arguably worse than the actual medical danger was the suffocating cultural stigma attached to it. In this highly patriarchal society, the blood associated with childbirth was deeply feared. It was labeled as kegare, which means ritual impurity or pollution. Because of this extreme fear, women in labor were often forced out of their homes into isolated, unsanitary huts to give birth alone. If they tragically died out there, they weren't just mourned by their families. They were genuinely feared as toxic, cursed entities that can infect the community. The religious terror surrounding this was absolute. Buddhist teachings of the era actually dictated that dying in childbirth was a sin, simply due to the inherent impurity of the birthing blood. Dying mothers were believed to be condemned straight to the blood pool hell. And it gets worse. Their deceased infants were said to be sent to Sino-Kawara, a desolate, purgatory-like underworld riverbed where the children were forced to endlessly stack stones. The Ubume wasn't just a scary story. She represented the absolute, paralyzing theological terror of eternal damnation, simply as a punishment for trying to give birth.
The collective fear of a deceased mother returning as a highly cursed, impure Ubume was so overwhelming that a community couldn't just hold a funeral, bury these women, and move on. They were completely desperate to protect themselves from the spiritual fallout. So villagers turned to some incredibly drastic, highly complex, and honestly gruesome community rituals. These practices were essentially magical countermeasures. The whole goal was to aggressively sever the deceased mother's supernatural attachment to the mortal plane, aiming to prevent a haunting before it could even begin.
Perhaps the most shocking countermeasure they used was a practice called the mi-futatsu ritual. The name literally translates to separating the two. In a desperate bid to physically and spiritually sever the attachment between mother and child, villagers would perform a post-mortem abdominal incision on the deceased pregnant woman. They would surgically remove the unborn fetus and then purposefully bury the mother and the child in completely separate graves. And if you think this is just some ancient medieval lore, get this. This clinical, deeply tragic burial practice actually survived in certain rural Japanese areas all the way into the mid-20th century. No way, right? But it's true. Relatives of the deceased would also perform a desperate, sorrowful ritual called the nagare kanjo, which translates to flowing anointment. They would go down to a local riverbank, set up wooden posts, and stretch a piece of cloth inscribed with sacred Buddhist sutras between them. People passing by were encouraged to pour river water over the cloth until the ink eventually completely washed away. This repetitive, communal act was believed to slowly cleanse the mother's spirit of her alleged blood pollution, hopefully, finally allowing her tortured soul to reach salvation. Thankfully, the incredible advancements of modern medicine have largely mitigated these specific historical horrors, making the immense physical dangers of childbirth a thing of the past for most of the world. But interestingly, the legend of the Ubume didn't disappear with the advent of modern hospitals. She just adapted to the times. She evolved from being a terrifying rural warning and a literal subject of intense religious dread into an incredibly prominent, heavily featured staple of modern global pop culture. Seriously, if you look for her, you can see her everywhere today. She serves as the central, terrifying mystery in Natsuhiko Kyogoku's massive best-selling novel, The Summer of the Ubume. If you play video games, you very likely fought her as a shrieking, incredibly difficult bird-like boss in the dark fantasy action RPG Nioh 2. She's even been adapted into slightly more family-friendly spooky forms in the popular Yokai Watch series. Whether she's a brutal video game enemy making you throw your controller or the tragic center of a mystery thriller, she absolutely continues to fascinate us. The Ubume was birthed from the very real, visceral tragedy of maternal mortality. She served as a dark, uncomfortable mirror for a society's immense guilt, their paralyzing fear of death, and their deep religious anxiety regarding women. We've dissected the myth, the history, and the absolute horror of it all today, which leaves us with one incredibly chilling final thought to ponder as we wrap up this explainer. If the terrifying monsters of the past so perfectly reflected the hidden, unspoken terrors of their time, what do the modern monsters we invent today say about the societal fears that we are still too afraid to name aloud? Thank you so much for exploring this nightmare with me. Keep asking those hard questions and never stop learning.